So oftentimes I get contacted in panic mode from a guy or a girl. The relationship has started to go downhill and their partner is starting to throw labels at them. Narcissist, borderline personality, sociopath, psychopath. When your partner calls you these things, it can be a wake-up call. It can be scary. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have these disorders, but it does mean that something about your behavior is hitting those traits. So in this video, I want to break down why your partner thinks that you are a narcissist, a sociopath, a psychopath, and then I want to talk about what you can do to tackle the situation effectively and ultimately repair your relationship. So as a relationship starts to get damaged, some pretty big labels can be thrown around. Maybe you've even done it yourself to your partner. Now, don't get me wrong, being called a narcissist or being called a sociopath doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to be labeled with anything, really. It ultimately feels like your partner doesn't really understand you. But sometimes when we feel in this defensive mode, we can make some really big mistakes with dealing with being called these labels. So before I jump into why your partner thinks you're a narcissist, I want to jump straight into the biggest mistakes you can make in this situation. It's really important to know these because these can make or break your partner's idea that you have these narcissism or sociopathy traits, right? So it's really important to know these mistakes so that you can avoid them in order to rebuild the relationship. The biggest mistake of all is getting defensive. So when you jump to defend yourself with, saying things like, well, I'm not a narcissist, or you're trying to explain away your partner's feelings, you end up invalidating their perspective. And this defensiveness feels like you're dismissing their emotions, which reinforces the idea that you maybe lack empathy, which is exactly what you're being accused of, right? So this is a mistake because it shuts down productive conversation. It confirms your partner's belief that you are prioritizing protecting yourself over understanding where they are coming from. But then there's also playing the victim. So responding to your partner saying these things, saying, well, you're always blaming me. Why don't you see all of the good things that I do? This flips the focus back onto your own feelings. So this comes across as selfish and dismissive because instead of addressing your partner's pain, your partner's feelings and their thoughts and opinions, you're centering yourself. And this ultimately, again, makes your partner feel unheard and frustrated. And it reinforces this idea that you're unwilling to take responsibility for whatever actions you've taken within the relationship. If you're not owning your role in the relationship, then this reinforces this idea of narcissism or sociopathy or psychopathy. So it's understandable if these accusations feel really extreme, but it's important to understand where your partner is coming from rather than jumping in, playing the victim and getting dismissive and defensive. But the biggest mistake of all is avoiding the issue completely. So brushing off your partner's concerns, saying like, this is ridiculous, or storming off from the conversation. This signals that you're unwilling to engage with your partner. You're prioritizing, again, yourself over your partner's feelings. And this avoidance doesn't actually make the problem go away. It actually makes it worse. It reinforces, again, this idea that you have these disorders, right? These labels. And it makes your partner feel abandoned and builds up resentment within the relationship. Ultimately, this deepens the emotional disconnect between you and your partner because you are avoiding the point of connection. When your partner expresses their feelings, whether it's negative or positive, this is either a point of connection or disconnect. And if you're choosing to walk away, then you are choosing the disconnect. And as you've probably seen, the common thread in all of these big mistakes is dismissing your partner's emotional experience. And if you follow me for a little while, you'll know about this idea of emotional safety, which I've done a deeper dive video, which I'll link to up above and in the description down below. But emotional safety is the space to be able to express your feelings without fear of negative consequences. And ultimately, all of these things dismiss your partner's emotional experience. It destroys emotional safety, whether it's through defensiveness, self-pity, or avoidance. And each one of these, over time, causes a disconnect between you both rather than leaning into it and being able to provide a connection. And over time, it signals that you're unwilling to take accountability or even change your behaviors in order to help the relationship. So this leaves the question, why? Why does your partner think that you're a narcissist? Why does your partner think that you lack empathy or that you have sociopathy? Well, the first reason is that your partner feels invisible in the relationship. So oftentimes you can dominate conversations about your own problems without realizing how much you're doing it. Maybe when your partner says, oh, I'm having a rough day, you reply with, yeah, me too. This is what happened to me at work. And every conversation ends up revolving around you and your feelings. And this can ultimately make your partner feel kind of invisible. And this can happen quite often without even realizing it. especially if you're a fellow ADHD and you can talk a lot, failing to prioritize your partner's emotional needs means that you can end up sidestepping your partner's feelings and ultimately starting to destroy this emotional safety that we talk about. Next is if you have a very low standard of validating your partner's emotions. So with this, I want you to think about how you react when your partner is upset. So for example, your partner is saying, hey, I don't like the way you speak to me. And you jump in and get defensive. You jump in and say, you're wrong. This is invalidation. This is dismissing your partner's feelings, ultimately failing to put yourself in your partner's shoes and being able to say, you know what, I can see how it would feel that way. Being able to validate to a very, very high level is going to be really crucial for any relationship. And people get caught up on this idea of, well, I disagree with them. Why would I validate when I disagree? But validation and agreement are very, very different. You can put yourself in your partner's shoes and go, I can see why you would feel that way. Validation does not equal agreement. You can understand why someone would steal food in order to provide from their family, but you can disagree with it internally. You can think to yourself, I would not do that because I have a different way of living, but I can understand why you would do. These are two very different things, and being able to verbalize and validate your partner's feelings is absolutely crucial to being able to build this relationship. Or if your partner comes to you with a problem and you jump into fix it mode. So your partner says, you know, I've had a terrible day at work, and you jump in and say, well, why don't you do XYZ? This isn't helpful. It's dismissive. This is invalidating to your partner. So 99% of the time when someone is expressing their feelings, they're not looking for answers. They're looking to feel seen and understood. And that's ultimately what communication should be about. So as an example, if your partner says, I feel like you don't appreciate what I do around the house, a dismissive response would be, well, of course I appreciate you. You're just overreacting. This is not validating your partner's feelings. This is dismissing them. It's putting them to the side. Another reason why your partner feels these things about you is because their view is shaped by what we call expectancy bias. So your partner's opinion of you doesn't change overnight. It happens in very, very small moments, like we've spoken about. If you're invalidating very often, if you're dismissing your partner's feelings, if you're not following through with the things that you say that you're going to do, this slowly breaks down trust. And then once your partner gets the idea that you are maybe acting self-centered, you're acting selfishly, that you don't prioritize them or the relationship, over time, they will start to find more and more things that confirm that view. And this is what we call expectancy bias. This isn't just to do with your partner. This is a human trait that we all have. Your brain is wired to look for evidence to support your own conclusions. So for example, if over time you've been dismissing and invalidating and all of these things, and then you leave the dishes in the sink by accident, this comes across as selfish, even though it may not have been your intent. You may have just forgotten about it. You didn't ask about your partner's big meeting at work. This is self-centered because what you do starts to be tainted by this idea of expectancy bias. And this may not feel fair. It may feel like you're being painted as someone that you're not. But ultimately, this is human psychology. And this is not based on nothing. This is based on your past actions. So you have to break this pattern by showing up differently, repeatedly, and rebuilding that trust that has been broken between you both, until the expectancy bias starts to work in your favor. Ultimately, the more that you show up, the more that you raise your standards on how you act, the more this expectancy bias starts to work in your favor. Your partner starts to expect good things from you, starts to see things that you do in a selfless light. Your partner will see the effort that you're putting in, and you'll always get the benefit of the doubt. And that is why it's so crucial to make sure that you're leading by example. The next big thing when it comes to understanding why you're being seen as a narcissist or a sociopath or any of these sort of labels is it's because negative feedback loops have taken over. So relationships are never ruined by one or two bad fights. They're eroded by repeated patterns of hurt and blame. And what happens is if your partner acts negatively and then you respond negatively, this will carry on feeding back into itself and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, creating a negative feedback loop unless somebody breaks it. And oftentimes in relationships, we can sit there and wait for our partner to break it. And this becomes an even bigger feedback loop because we're not taking the responsibility to break that loop. Being stuck in a negative feedback loop is pretty easy to spot when you start to notice what to look for. So responding defensively to criticism, avoiding conflict instead of resolving it, both of you fueling the same narrative about each other. They think you're selfish, you think they're selfish. When you react in a negative way to someone acting negative towards you, your roles keep reinforcing each other. You are ultimately doing exactly the same thing as them. So as this negative feedback loop gets bigger and bigger, You start to reinforce your own role. Your partner treats you like a child, so you start to act like a child. You start to act up. This is your own expectancy bias coming in, reacting negatively to your partner because you're expecting the worst from it. And then they start to expect the worst from you. And ultimately, this is why I call BS on when people say, well, it takes two to tango. Ultimately, it takes one person to break a negative feedback loop, because ultimately the relationship is 50-50, and you can convince yourself that you're putting in 100% of your 50%. But if you're not breaking that negative feedback loop, if you're not the one that's taking the right steps in order to stop that negative feedback loop, then you're not putting in the 100%. And it's sidestepping your own responsibility within the relationship. You convince yourself that you are, but ultimately deep down, internally, you're blaming your partner and you're waiting for your partner to do what you should be doing all along. So this may be tough to hear and it may be a struggle to really get your head around, but in order to start repairing the relationship, once you take that responsibility and you can break this feedback loop, then your partner's view of you will start to change. These ideas that you're a narcissist or a sociopath will start to diminish because you're showing up in an empathetic way. You're taking the time to understand your partner. You're taking the time to look at the relationship as a whole rather than two people against each other. And just before I jump into this, obviously there's only so much depth that I can sort of go in a YouTube video. But if you do want a deeper dive into all of this and understanding how relationships work and ultimately how to repair, build and grow a healthy relationship long term, then join me on my relationship bootcamp, where you'll learn the same steps that all of my members start with in order to start repairing their relationships and rebuilding them from the ground up. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to join us. So understanding why your partner feels like you are a narcissist or a sociopath or one of these labels and avoiding these massive mistakes is crucial to be able to handle the situation properly and ultimately undo this false idea. Ultimately the main reason why your partner thinks that you have these narcissistic traits is because when it comes to a difficult environment, if a relationship has been damaged or is going through a rough patch, we can get defensive. We can go into self-protection mode. And these self-protection modes have these narcissistic, sociopathic elements to them. If you think about it, if you feel unsafe emotionally, then you can be dismissive of your partner's feelings because you're like, well, I don't feel safe within myself. I don't feel like I can express myself in a healthy way, in a nice way. So you start to become defensive and you start to avoid conversations. You start to push your partner away. You start to dismiss their feelings because ultimately you're too busy trying to protect yourself than to think about them. And this comes across to them as you lacking empathy, you lacking the ability to be able to see how they feel. And it comes across as you being selfish. So understanding why your partner feels this way is going to be really helpful in being able to undo this false view of you, right? Because ultimately, if you handle this poorly, you're going to make your partner's belief that you're a narcissist or a sociopath even stronger. So enough about this negativity and this worry. How do we repair the damage that has been caused in order for our partner to think about this? So let's talk about solutions. Ultimately, this isn't about groveling or proving your partner wrong. This is about stepping up and becoming the partner that leads the relationship in the right direction, taking the effective path in order to repair the relationship rather than only thinking about our own feelings. So step one is to make sure that you're listening without defending. So you need to understand your partner's perspective before it will change. So when your partner brings up their feelings about narcissism, sociopathy, selfishness, cruelness, it's imperative that you resist the urge to explain yourself, defend yourself, or fix the situation. The lowest bar in a relationship is the ability to just listen. And this is so important to be able to learn how to clear this bar. And listening isn't just shutting up and waiting for your turn to speak. Listening is being able to reflect and validate why your partner feels the way that they feel. And again, this doesn't mean that you agree with them. It's saying to them, if I were in your shoes, I would feel that way. So for example, you can say, I can see why you'd feel that way. I didn't realize that my actions were coming across as selfish. Thank you so much for letting me know. Or if you're unsure what your partner's feeling, then ask. Say, hey, I don't really understand why you see me as being selfish. Can you help me to understand why you're feeling this way? From my perspective, I think that my intent was to help, but maybe it's not coming across that way. Can you help me understand that? This shows that you still have a different point of view, but you're willing to listen and understand why your partner feels differently. It shows that you're actively trying to understand, which in itself is a non-narcissistic sociopathic behavior. Step two is to take accountability. So don't give yourself any excuses. Even if your perception isn't 100% accurate to you, there's a reason why your partner feels this way. And you need to be able to own your part in the relationship. For example, maybe you have let work taken over and that's caused a lot of distance within the relationship. So being able to say something like, I think I've been so focused on work lately that I've kind of dropped the ball on being present within the relationship. And I think that's something that I really need to work on. That is taking accountability for your role in the relationship and not giving yourself excuses of, well, there's a reason why I didn't show up. There's a reason why I didn't do this. You're not explaining yourself. You're simply taking accountability and creating a path forward. Next, it's important to break the negative feedback loop. So once you start responding differently to conflict, to escalation, this is where the feedback loop starts to change. This is where the expectancy bias starts to diminish and to fade away. So if your partner is upset, focus on de-escalation instead of getting defensive. I've actually done a much deeper dive onto de-escalation, which I'll link to up above and in the description down below. Making sure that you're hearing your partner, you're being able to show that you're listening and you're understanding and being able to take accountability. And then the most important step is making sure that you're being consistent. Challenging this expectancy bias is not about changing your partner's perception of you with persuasion or explanations or defensiveness. If your partner is going to change their perception of you, this requires consistent actions over time, making sure that you're showing up with actions rather than words. So even though it may feel natural to get defensive and to defend yourself about how you're not a narcissist, you're not a sociopath, how you do care, making sure that you're showing up differently and challenging this idea of you with actions rather than words. This in itself will show rather than tell, because ultimately nothing destroys trust faster than empty words. If you say you're going to do something, do it. So if you say that you are ready to take accountability and change, do it. Don't just talk about it. Don't try to prove to your partner or stand and point at it. Making sure that you're just showing up because it's who you are rather than doing it to try and change your partner's perception. Because ultimately in a relationship, this is not about winning or losing. This is about doing what's best for the relationship, doing what's best to build the connection. And understanding why your partner feels this way right now and understanding that your partner is not always going to feel this way is really, really important. Emotions are temporary. Opinions are temporary. So being able to show up in the right ways is going to help to guide your relationship to a much better place and be able to start repairing and growing it moving forward. So yes, it may feel unfair that your partner has these opinions about you, but once you start to dig in and listen to why your partner feels these ways, you'll start to see that it is fair and that there are things that you can do in order to change that perspective. A lot of people try to avoid conflict in relationships. They try to avoid these fights by walking away or by winning this argument. But that's not how relationships are growing. This is not how your partner's perspective of you changes, by avoiding these points of conflict. I've actually done a deeper dive video, which I'll link to on the screen and in the description down below, making sure that you're not avoiding the conflict, you're just handling it in a very different way than you have done in the past. Is going to be really important for undoing these negative perceptions about you. So I'm going to leave you with that deeper dive video, and I will see you over there.